Hello there, welcome back to the channel. This is Romulan Empire, and in the final episode in our current series on the comparisons between the Romulans and the Klingons. This one is the most exciting of all. A quick analysis and breakdown of Romulan versus Klingon politics. Stay with me, because this ain't your granddaddy's politics here. Before we get started, please like, share, subscribe and comment down below. And yeah, let's get started. Let's start with the Klingons. The Klingons are actually one of the two factions here we know more about their internal political structure. Starting from the earliest known point, way back when, in the days when the Klingons still had even more religious beliefs and were a more primitive society, they were invaded by the Hook. Before that event, they were divided like humans into various different warring kingdoms. They coalesced under Kahless and fought a resistance, and ultimately Kahless forged the first High Council, and he became the Emperor. After him there may have been other emperors, it's not exactly clear, but basically a sort of democratic sort of chancellery took its place. I think in Klingon terms it would be more of a meritocracy, or whoever's an oligarchy or something. Basically whoever's strongest is in charge. So the Klingons, that would be meritocracy though, so anyway. Fast forward to the days of the 22nd century, and the Klingons have a chancellor, a high council, but the Klingon government is incredibly cutthroat. We know that basically each member of the high council is the head of their own house, which is like its own faction. Each one have their own armies and forces loyal to them. This can be sort of seen as a comparison, an analogy to medieval Europe or feudal Japan. This was a feudalistic system where different lords paid fealty to the chancellor, and they brought their own houses and all of their acolytes and as a result their forces, their wealth and their resources. Planets they controlled, shipyards they controlled, fleets they controlled, and armies that they controlled in the name of the chancellor, and they brought them to his or her banner. We see that in the 22nd century this was working perfectly fine, but somewhere along the way this broke down. By the 23rd century the Klingons had devolved more into infighting than less of a coherent empire, until of course a new chancellor would be put into place. And under L'Rell, the Klingons once again unify and develop the D7 battlecruiser, but again you see that by this point the different houses have their own navies and their own fleets. This is an immensely cutthroat system where as soon as one chancellor dies, all the next ones in the line of succession start looking for a way to get power. If they can't seize power, either by being stronger than their opponent, politically more savvy, more intelligent or whatever, you then need an arbiter of succession. Now in the case in the 24th century where this happened, the Kimpek actually appointed Jean-Luc Picard to be the arbiter of succession between Duras and Gowron. The reason he did this is because he didn't feel he could trust any existing Klingon, as again very cutthroat system, and he wanted someone external. Picard had a good reputation and he knew that the Federation would want to maintain peace. He also knew that either Gowron or Duras, wonder which one, had poisoned him. This was an incredibly cowardly attack, which brings us neatly into the Romulans in just a moment. This level of infighting and assassination and treachery is almost worthy of the Terran Empire in its levels of bureaucratic evilness. Gowron would actually be one of the most successful candidates and leaders of the Klingon Empire until he himself was assassinated by Worf, a Starfleet officer, ironically, even though he was Klingon. But Worf would not take the job, as usually assassinating a chancellor kind of meant you got it, or he was able to appoint, with the support of some generals and other members of the council, Martok to become the next chancellor. And by all accounts Martok was a very level-headed chancellor. But the Klingon chancellor, despite the honour of the Klingon society, were always having to watch their back and just wait for the next person to come along who wanted power, and it would always usually be one of the other members of the High Council who felt that they'd rule better or stronger. Amongst the Klingons, rule by strength was all that really mattered. Gowron was a politician. He was very good at playing the political game, not just with other races but with other Klingons, and he was good at keeping things level and stable. Even though he wasn't the greatest fighter or warrior, there was obviously more to it. the Klingon government had more bureaucratic facets, sort of behind the scenes players in probably what would be more the greater power brokers of the Empire rather than the power holders. The men and women who the Chancellor and the members of the High Council really depended on to do the day-to-day administration of government, such as individuals who'd be in charge of distribution of resources, agriculture, and other sorts of things. You had lower adjutants of this and secretaries of that. All positions that we don't necessarily associate, as we always think Klingons are just a bunch of warriors. But when you get to the highest levels, it tends to get a little more cutthroat. Now again, segueing into the Romulans. The Romulan government's a little more mysterious. It's modelled, obviously, on the old Roman Empire's government. At the top there is a praetor. Below the praetor there is a senate. There are many different levels to the senate, with consuls and other such people sitting in different positions of power and authority. The head of the Tal Shiar usually also assumed a position within the Senate and was basically the number one after the praetor, usually. That wasn't a guarantee, but it usually kind of was how it went. As Shinzon would put it, there was a change of government on Romulus, as often happens, to paraphrase him. One Romulan government would often replace another, either through, again, internal bureaucracy, assassination, discrediting their opponent, dirt smearing, and generally backstabbing were very common within the Romulan political landscape. And generally, to survive in the incredibly cutthroat world of being a Romulan politician, you yourself had to be incredibly ruthless and powerful. It wasn't the same kind of barbarism, to a degree, to use the word, that you would see in the Klingon government, but certainly it was hardly a joyous place to work. As we see, Shinzon managed to assassinate the entire Senate and simply replace it. And this is just something that's kind of accepted in Romulan society, that you're able to just supplant one government with another and just merrily carry on trucking. Responsibility and accountability within the Romulan government, similar to within the Klingon government, was severely punished for incompetence or stupidity or perceived treachery. Senator Kretak, for example, likely ended up either definitely thrown out of the Senate, probably ended up in prison for the rest of her life or a very long time if she wasn't executed for conspiring with Federation spies. Probably she was executed. This is the norm for the Romulan government, where everyone there is mostly now, because they're basically always looking to stab someone else in the back while simultaneously looking to protect their own back. Only the most ambitious and the most ruthless of these individuals will achieve absolute power and become the praetor of the Empire, and as a result those men and women tend to be the most savage and most brutal. We know very little about any specific named praetors other than Shinzon, and he was human of Riemann raising. We of course know the others were mostly, if not all, Romulan, but we know painfully little about them. We know bits and pieces, but generally speaking it's more Romulan admirals and commanders that the Federation will be more familiar with. Although it's likely Starfleet and the Federation does know the identities and some background information about many of the people in the highest levels of the Romulan government, including their praetors, that information is, I'm going to go with classified for whatever reason. And basically these two governments, although seem ideologically opposed, overlap in many different ways. The Klingons and the Romulans are more similar than they are different in a lot of important ways. Unfortunately, the ways they are similar tends to be in ruthlessness, cruelty and brutality and selfishness, and these are massively exaggerated traits on both sides when you get to the upper echelons of power, with them not particularly wanting to power share, so alliances between these two races don't work very well, as we saw in the 23rd century, where each race probably thought that it should be dominant over the other. The Klingons saw themselves as stronger, better fighters, the Romulans saw themselves as smarter, more intelligent and more worthy to lead. And likely these two different outlooks, which don't complement one another, are probably the main reasons for the breaking down in their alliance, although we have heard statements from the Romulans about how the Klingons didn't stick to their agreements, but quite frankly we don't really know what that meant. The exact reason for the breakdown of their alliance is unknown, But we do know the Romulans in particular have interfered in the internal politics of the Klingon government far more. The Klingon culture and structure lends itself a great deal more, maybe not to corruption per se, but it does lend itself to an easier access by outsiders to potentially interfere and corrupt that regime if you're powerful enough and have enough resources, such as when Sela did this, conspiring with the Duras family again to try to usurp power away from Gowron, not long after he'd initially taken power in the Klingon High Council. So there we have the basic breakdowns. As I said, they're more similar than they are different, but the ways they are different is in the execution, but the basic principles tend to be the same. The tenets of both governments are imperialistic, ambitious, and believe in continual expansion. Both the Klingons and the Romulans, although interpret this philosophy slightly differently, the end goal is ultimately the same, and it is to accumulate power over others and rule them. The Klingons, more so than the Romulans in the early days, would certainly learn to evolve this culture, and to a point where it would almost seem like the Klingons are members of the Federation in the 24th century, if not full members, then certainly strong allies with it. And we know eventually the Romulans too would join the Federation, but it took a serious shake-up of their society, mostly the destruction of said society and the deaths of probably billions of Romulans, in order for them to break the shackles of their previous regime and allow those that wanted reunification and a return to a more peaceful way of life and away from the dictatorship of the incredibly ruthless and infighting Romulan government, to, as I say, to be more like their Vulcan brothers and reunify and be a better people. In fact, we even know that it was the Romulans who pushed to remain members of the Federation, more so even than the Vulcans, who were one of its founding member races, which is interesting and shows how far in many ways the Romulan race would come in the following centuries after the 24th. Into the 25th and 26th century, certainly after the destruction of Romulus. As I said, they're more alike than they are different, but the ways they're alike mean that they never really get along. Now, as I've said before, the important thing to take away from this is it'll be alright. Soon be Christmas.
I just want to take this moment to thank you for watching that video. If you liked what you saw, please check out my social links in the description box below to Instagram and Twitter and others, and also is down there a link to my Patreon page where you can support this channel and the others as I try to grow this franchise and do this more regularly. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.